Good morning and welcome to Dialogue with Dinkins. Today will be the final episode of this series, and I want to take a moment to thank everyone for all their hard work in making this show a success through the years. We've been at it now for 20 years. So to Cynthia and Jesse and Chris, I'm very grateful. Chris is not often right in the studio, but Jesse is always here. It is he who has made me sound intelligent when the truth would have scuttled me. And Cynthia is a very special lady, mother of Ariel, and I love her like our daughter. There's only one way, or one right way, to conclude my time on Dialogue with Dinkins, and that is with guests and a discussion about the one and only Percy Ellis Sutton. But here in the studio with us is Glenn Hunter, a mainstay in the Harlem cultural community. Glenn is the co-founder and board chair of the Harlem Cultural Archives Historical Society. He also serves his community as a high school math teacher for the New York City Department of Education, as well as an adjunct lecturer at Baruch College in college algebra. Do you know that it is written that the mathematician has reached the highest rung on the ladder of human thought? See, now I studied a little math, but I'm not a mathematician.
I heard you were a math major at Howard, from what I
Yeah,
understand.
I graduated with honors, and I even won a fellowship to Rutgers University, but I was not nearly what you are, sir.
Thank you
I
very much.
decided to go to law school because, meaning no disrespect to any member of the family who's a lawyer, you don't need to be too smart to be a lawyer. So that's what I did. But the way to conclude my time on Dialogue with Dinkins is with guests and a discussion about the one and only Percy Ellis Sutton. Let me remind us of that night on 1993 in November, when I had to make a concession speech, and people were very unhappy, wanted me to denounce everything in sight, demand a recount, and language like that. And I said, no, we don't have coups and revolutions, we have elections. And mayors come and mayors go, but the city must endure. Man, I was a real statesman. Next morning, I looked at my bride and I said, you know what? We got less than 60 days to get out of Gracie Mansion, find a place to live, and a means to pay the rent, and simultaneously transition an entire government in a professional way, lest they say, see, you let those people in and see what they did. But so here I am with less than 60 days and no job. Not surprisingly, the phone rang, and it was Percy Ellis Sutton. He said, how'd you like to do a radio show at WLIB? And he said, we'll pay you. And he named a figure, and I hesitated a second. He said, all right, and he upped it. And so for, 6 or 7 years, I was on the air twice a week, a live show with guests, and then for the last, 12, 15 years, I've been doing this show, which we tape, and it runs on Saturday morning at 8 a.m., and it's been a real joy. So it seems to me, to talk about Percy, we couldn't do better than having you, Glenn, here in the studio with me, and on the phone, the fighter pilot. When somebody greets Roscoe Brown and calls him the fighter pilot, he knows that they've been talking to me.
That's right.
And Roscoe, I am so fond, as I tell my students, when you come up and lecture for me, as you have done for low 20 years, and I said, this Dr. Brown is a real PhD. I mean, he got his doctorate in education, and it's not an honorary degree of any sort. And I tell him how long you were the president of Bronx Community College, 15, 16 years, and what you have done. You were one of the founders of 100 Black Men. You've done so much. And this, mind you, is on top of being the first in your group to shoot down a German jet while flying a prop over Germany. So you are the true hero.
Well, you are a very excellent communicator. As a matter of fact, I should hire you as my public relations agent. That's your next job.
Well, it would be easy to talk about you because, as you know, I really do love you. You are amazing. And Glenn, when the Congress and the president determined to give a Congressional Gold Medal to Montford Point Marines who served at Montford Point, who were trained at Montford Point, Camp Lejeune, as opposed to Parris Island, South Carolina, where the white recruits were trained.
Right.
And they decided to give us this medal. So I called Roscoe. I said, Roscoe, they're going to give me a Congressional Gold Medal along with the rest of everybody who was there from 1942 to 1949. And I said, Roscoe, you're a real hero. I mean, is it all right? And Roscoe said, yeah, it's okay, Dave. You can go get it. Remember that, buddy?
I definitely remember that because I thought a moment, because the Marines always think they're the best, but off we go into the wild beyond it means the Air Force is really on top. And we're all on top because we're in the sky, 30,000 feet.
And you were, I guess at that time you were a captain?
I was squadron commander of the 100th Fighter Squadron.
And you couldn't have been more than 22 years old.
Actually, I had just turned 23 when I shot down the jet on March 24th, 1945, 69 years ago.
Wow.
Lots of time. But we're here to talk about a real hero, Percy Ellis Sutton, whom I first met when I was in the Tuskegee Airmen. I didn't meet him while he was training at Tuskegee, but when I went overseas as a young replacement pilot, one of the first people I met was Percy Ellis Sutton, who was the intelligence officer for the 332nd. He would tell us where the enemy fire was going to be, how high the clouds were going to be, where the target was. And most of the time, he was right, always telling that. Sometimes he missed it a little and we got shot at. But that's what war's all about. But then after the war, I met Percy back here in New York when he was riding the subway as a subway conductor going to law school. And then after that, as he was bureau president, I worked with him on several projects. And finally, when he founded Inner City Broadcasting Company, I joined him. It was on the board of Inner City, which was the parent of WLIB and WBLS. And then finally, I worked with him in several projects in communication. So he was one of my real heroes, one of the best communicators, one of the most fearsome people, and one of the most dedicated civil rights people I've ever known.
Well, I concur. And I had the privilege of serving in the assembly with Percy. And in those days, they didn't have microphones as they have today. And there was a fellow named Ken Brown, black guy from Queens, who had been an assistant district attorney. and he was at the very top, and Percy was down in what we call the well, in seat number 1. And as is the custom when a member was speaking and you wanted to interrupt and ask a question, the person who wanted to put the question would rise and say, "Mr. Speaker, will a member yield to a question?" So Ken Brown had a deep voice, and he would stand and say, "Mr. Speaker, will a member yield to a question?" And of course, the answer is always in the affirmative, and so then Ken would start off always in an antagonistic tone and fashion. He would say, "You mean to tell me," sort of like that. And when he got through, Percy would rise, and Percy would say, "Mr. Speaker, will a member yield to a question?" And of course he would, and then Percy would say, "I come from the village of Harlem. Walk in my shoes." When Percy got through, you could hear a pin drop. I mean, he was so good. And he had this unique capacity to know, as he used to tell us, you can't dance every set. So we would pick our fights, and that way we won most of them. The Sikh program exists today because of Percy Sutton. He led me and Shirley Chisholm and a whole bunch of us into the speaker's room in the DeWitt Clinton Hotel back in 1966 and explained to the speaker that without our votes, he wouldn't have a majority to be elected speaker, and they would face the embarrassing circumstance that they had in 1965 when the state stood still for more than 30 days and Governor Rockefeller got Republicans to vote for Tony Travier over Stanley Steingut. And so we saw that. But Percy always could see farther down the line than anybody else. It was he, as you both know, who in 1977 ran for mayor with such class and distinction that nobody laughed at me when I dared try in '89.
That's correct.
And that's where the term Gang of Four created, because in the politics of it, they felt that by not supporting Herman Rodriguez, the Gang of Four from Harlem, Charlie Rangel, Basil Patterson, Dave Dinkins, and Percy Sutton, got in the way. So that's a distinction rather than a negative term, I would say.
Well, we sort of treated it that way. It was sort of like Nixon's enemies list. You know, we wore it with pride. And incidentally, Roscoe, if you haven't been told, and Glenn, what we're going to do is change Percy's son, whose name is Pierre. We call him Pepe.
Right.
We're going to change his name to Percy. And you might inquire, well, why in the hell do you want to do that? And the reason is Basil Patterson's son, Daniel, has a son whose name is Basil Patterson. Charlie Rangel's daughter has a son whose name is Charlie Rangel. My bride and I, we have a little boy whose name is David Dinkins. So when we change Pepe's name to Percy, we'll have a whole new brand new Gang of Four.
There we go.
Of course, the issues that the Gang of Four has to deal with today are a lot different than they were yesterday.
Well, we see, but the reason we are aware of that, though, is because Glenn is, he compiles our history. And Glenn, you've got something upcoming that's going to be pretty interesting.
Yes, it is. And as a matter of fact, it's a conversation with yourself and Congressman Rangel and Basil Patterson talking about the major accomplishments of Percy Sutton. We have reserved the Great Hall at City College for a date on September 26th from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. And at that time, you know, we'd like to see as many people that can fit into that place come in and hear you gentlemen speak as you're speaking now about Mr. Sutton. As I was saying to you when we first came in, that he's done so many things, any one of them alone would have made him a noteworthy individual. But he's so multi-talented in the fields of mentoring. One of the ones near and dear to my heart is media, and the fact that he's allowed, when he first bought WBLS and WLIB, it gave us an opportunity to really get the story straight about our own and portray a positive image about our own at the same time. So that's something we want to let the world know about, in a conversation. Like you say, it can be a little town hall, it can be some testimonials, but more importantly, we want to make sure that our young people know how great this man was and how significant he was, and how his accomplishments affected people all over the world.
Well, I'm looking forward to that. I truly am. There's a story that Charlie Rangel and I tell of how we were riding to Albany one Monday morning. Percy was driving. He was driving what in those days they call a compact car. It was a small vehicle, really registered to his wife, Leatrice. And en route to Albany, a front tire blew. And Percy struggled to keep control of the car and flipped over on its roof, exactly upside down. And there was Percy, Charlie, a fellow named Dinkins, spelled with a J, and me. Dinkins was injured, but the other three of us, we were okay. And word spread that what a great job Percy had done in keeping control of the vehicle so it didn't go across the median into ongoing traffic. And so when we walked into the assembly chamber the next day, everybody stood and applauded. And what a great job Percy had done. Then Charlie and I talked to our lawyer. We decided he was negligent as hell, and we sued Percy and Leatrice, and we made a couple of bucks on that thing too. So we laugh about that.
You didn't lose a friend. That's
No, but I'm telling you, but Percy, it was Percy who led us in the Black Political Convention in Gary, Indiana. Back in, I guess must have been 70. He always was aware of what was going on around him and elsewhere, and he brought so many of us along with him. And so, God, boy, do we miss Percy.
Well, the main thing about Percy Sutton is the fact that he had vision, and he had the courage to advance those visions when a lot of other people have stood back. Percy's always thinking, up to the last day, what he was going to do, what we could do for our people, what we could do to challenge the system. And he, as you know, he's one of the first supporters of Jesse Jackson when he ran for president in '84. He's done so many things, and I'm glad that they're naming scholarships and streets and other things after him, because he certainly deserves it. Percy Ellis Sutton, the savior of the Apollo Theater.
Yes.
We know that Percy got his own money and some unfinished money and got Apollo reconstructed, which is now the jewel of Harlem. So everywhere we turn around, there's some lingering remembrance of Percy Sutton.
Let me remind us also that it was Percy who persuaded Charlie Rangel to run for Congress against Adam Powell some 40 years ago. And he won by, 100 votes. But it was Percy who could see that it was time.
Of course, the other part of that is a lot of us thought that Percy ought to be the one running. But Percy felt he could do the better job behind the scenes, doing what he was doing. And Charlie Rangel has been an outstanding congressman for Harlem for 42 years.
Mm-hmm. Well, I got to tell you, I want to thank you, Roscoe, for being part of this. Glenn and I are going to continue on with for another half hour, just about, and we anticipate being joined by my brother, Congressman Charlie Rangel. But it is I cannot tell you how pleased I am that you cleared things out of your schedule so that you could join us for this period here.
I certainly wouldn't have missed it. For 20 years, you've been telling the world what's going on in the New York community, and I want to thank you for what you've done for us, and I want to thank you for having me on. And remember Percy Sutton. He's the man.
And thank you, Dr. Brown, for opening up the communication lines with City College. We would never have gotten to
Okay, good enough, buddy.
Thank you. Okay, Dr. Brown.
Roscoe is really a unique human being.
Very much so.
I remember, I guess it was his 90th birthday, and we had an event over at in Queens at the Terrace on the Park, and my bride and I were there, and Roscoe loved to dance, and he was dancing, and I don't know, around 11 o'clock, 11:30, Joyce and I left, and Roscoe was still on the floor dancing. He's remarkable. He truly is.
He's an amazing man.
Very shortly, Glenn, you're going to hear the strains of a number called Little Tiger.
Okay.
Now, Little Tiger is written and performed by Jay Hogarth, who's the father of our grandchildren. He cautions me that I should also point out that he's married to our daughter and not simply the father of our grandchildren. So I promised him that I would. And Little Tiger is named for his son Jamal, who is a proud graduate of UMass at Amherst.
Fantastic.
And now doing graduate work at the University of Texas at Austin. And people say, well, why are you going into all this discussion about your grandson at this time? What's the purpose of that? Well, the purpose is that that's our signal to have a commercial break.
Okay.
So you're listening to Dialogue with Dinkins. I'm Dave Dinkins. This is my absolute last segment in this series. We've been broadcasting at LIB for 20 years plus. And this last show, we have my friend Glenn Hunter, and we've had Roscoe Brown, the fighter pilot, on earlier. We anticipate having my brother, Congressman Charlie Rangel, during this last segment. But right now we're going to take a commercial break because even without me, or maybe especially without me, they got to pay the rent. So we got to run these commercials. We'll be right back after this break. Okay, we're back. This is Dave Dinkins. You're listening to Dialogue with Dinkins. This is a tape segment. You cannot call in. Although, if we're real lucky, we're going to have Congressman Charlie Rangel with us in this final segment. And not only is this the final segment of this show, it is the final segment, period, because this is the last time I'll be doing this show. And I will miss you all very much. I encounter people almost daily who will say things to me like, hey, how's Little Tiger? Or something that would indicate that they really listen to the show. So I want to thank my friends Cynthia and Jesse and Chris. And Jesse, who's been by my side throughout. And as I tell people, he makes me sound intelligent because folks don't know how inept I am, because he covers me up and lets me look good. But while we wait in hopes of being connected with Congressman Rangel, who's in a committee meeting in Washington, probably Ways and Means, but he's doing the people's work. And so we're going to continue with my in-studio guests, and he's got some very interesting stuff that we were talking about during the break, Glenn Hunter. Glenn, you were talking about the observations that you and others had made indicating a need for a historical society.
That's correct, Mayor. In 2006, during one of our annual reunions at the Riverton, my co-founder, Ken Sargent, who grew up in Percy Sutton's building, matter of fact, and I looked around at all the talent that was just there and said, we need to do a documentary on Riverton because it was so special. So once we started researching, we said, well, let's find, a historical society, that's just devoted to the Harlem community. And we found out that there was none. So after that, I did some research and I found out what was necessary, and we received a charter from the New York State Board of Regents, and we're incorporated to act as a historical society. So from that point on, we started to gather materials, and if I may just read our mission statement, it's very short.
Please do.
The mission of the Harlem Cultural Archives is to create, maintain, and grow a remotely accessible, online, interactive repository of audiovisual materials documenting Harlem's remarkable and varied multicultural legacies, including its storied past as well as its continuing contributions to the city and state of New York, the nation, and the world.
That's beautiful.
Thank you very much. And as one of our first honorees, our first legacy award went to yourself, Mayor Dinkins. That was back in 2008. And
you've done better since then.
Yes. We tried to recognize Percy Sutton in 2009, but at the time, I think his family didn't think it was appropriate because he was ailing at the time. But we also recognized the significant contributions of Constance Motley and Bruce Wright. We've also recognized the Lloyd E. Dinkins family for the work they did in Harlem, and the work for Dr. Billy Taylor and Dr. John Holloman. As a matter of fact, we're going to have streets named after Dr. Taylor and the famous Dr. Mike Holloman coming up soon. We had legislation passed in the city council, so it's a matter of us having a ceremony in the near future to and recognize those two gentlemen. But more importantly, we wanted to look at a multifaceted look at Harlem's legacies, not just in the political arena, but in the arts, the medical field, education, social work, civil rights. One of my favorite interviews was with Dr. Muriel Pettione, and she was a sweetheart. She told us some stories about how surgeons had no choice but to buy brownstones so that they could actually perform surgery because they didn't have admitting privileges in the hospitals. You told us a story that I didn't realize about Clifford Alexander Jr. when he was Secretary of the Army. And he was given a list of prospective generals, and there were no African Americans on that list. And he fired it back and said, "This is not acceptable. I need a new list." And the next list had Colin Powell on that list.
Yeah, I not too long ago, in the last 60 days or less, I was at a small dinner party with Cliff Alexander, and I said, I tell this story. I said, I don't know whether it's accurate or not, but that's the way I remember it. Mm-hmm. And he said, that is right. That is true. That's what happened.
That's correct. And again, these are things that impacted not just folks in Harlem, but folks all over the place. We also were talking off camera during the break about Frederick O'Neill. Frederick O'Neill was an icon when it came to actors' equity rights and labor activities. He actually trained Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte. Gertrude Jeanette was in one of his students, and much of the heavy lifting he did was while he was in Harlem. He met with Lyndon Johnson on several occasions, and people attribute the National Endowment of the Arts and those similar sort of endowments as a result of his push for having money, allocated to the arts on a regular basis. But I think more importantly was his work as Actors Equity president for about 9 or 10 years when it was 90% Caucasian, where actors who were resistant to perform in segregated theaters previously were forced to, but he was able to, work very hard and make it so that they didn't have to do that. And as a result, he was blackballed for a while there, but he knew what the right thing to do was, and he kept pushing. And in fact, the Schomburg Corporation was a result of a lot of his work as well. So there are so many of these stories to tell when it comes to folks who were living in Harlem. And one of the things that I think it's necessary to do is to let our young students know this material as well, because as a historical society, our charge is to promote the study of history, to make them curious, to find out what was going on in our neighborhoods, previously before they were born. And a neighborhood is supposed to be 3 generations, grandparent, parent, and children. My grandparents and parents and myself, raised a family in Harlem, so it is a neighborhood with a lot of rich history. And I really, to quote Jimmy Booker, you want to make sure the story is told correctly, because otherwise, you lose credibility, and I think people sort of lose interest if it's not pertinent to them, or if they can't relate to what you're telling them, or what you've uncovered. So it's something that Dr. Billy Taylor said to my brother and me when we were visiting him one time, when we were interviewing him for the Riverton documentary. He said, Glenn, if you don't do this, it's not going to get done. So he, in effect, gave us our marching orders. And like I said, I'm an accidental historian, but I've learned so much, and it's given me a lot of pride to say that I grew up in Harlem. I've lived in Harlem all my life, and when it was a time when nobody, really wanted to say they lived in Harlem, they would say, well, I live uptown, or I live, the Upper East Side, or something like that. I've always said, this is my home, and I'm glad. I'm very fortunate to live there, as opposed to looking at it as a negative.
Well, in the Marine Corps, it just happens that a couple of the platoons that came in about when I did were from the South. It was one where everybody was from Arkansas. Mm-hmm. But at any rate, you'd ask these guys, well, where you from, man? And they'd say, Harlem. Oh, yeah? Where do you live? 125th Street. Because that's all they knew.
That's right.
And it was funny. But I was just thinking as you were talking about Skiz Watson, mm-hmm. James L. Watson, who was a federal judge, and there's a courthouse downtown now named for him, the James L. Watson District Court or whatever. But it's got his name, and people wonder, well, who is Skiz Watson? Mm-hmm. And first of all, he and Bruce Llewellyn were first cousins.
That's correct. Yeah.
And but Skiz, one day we were sitting around waiting to start a meeting in Harlem, making plans for a community center, and Skiz Watson was the chairman of the group. Mm-hmm. So as hours wore on and people got agitated, and they said, "Go on, man, let's start." And so someone said, "No, man, we got to wait for the chairman. We got to wait for the judge." So Herb Evans walked in, who was a state Supreme Court judge. Mm-hmm. So the brother said, "Well, there, the judge down. Let's go." And the guy said, "No, man, I mean the heavy judge." So henceforth, mm-hmm. all federal judges I call the heavy judge. I have a friend of mine, a woman lovely woman in New Jersey, who's a federal judge. And so before I call her the heavy judge, I have to explain this story.
Please, yeah, that's a good idea.
But Skiz Watson was he was in the club with us at the Carver Democratic Club, And we just got a lot done because of Ray Jones, who understood that.
My grandmother was someone who worked pretty closely with Jake.
I think we've got my brother, the Congressman Charles B. Rangel. My brother.
Hey, David.
How you doing? The latest word I got was he was coming along slowly. I'm here in the studio with Glenn Hunter, whom you probably will know and remember. He's a mainstay in the Harlem cultural community, co-founder and board chair of the Harlem Cultural Archives Historical Society. And you and I don't know who else, Glenn, we're going to... Basil Patterson, we're going to talk about Percy Sutton up at City College.
In the Great Hall.
And incidentally, my brother, you may not have been told, but this is my absolute last show at WLIB.
Well, you're certainly going to be missed because your name has now become a household word. People have really looked forward to your in-depth discussions. They've been so very, very informative. So as with so many other of your accomplishments, you will be missed.
Well, thank you, my brother, because Charlie is my brother, and he's biased. Charlie, we got to tell a story about your mommy, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but I got to tell this. Charlie's mother challenged him one day and said, "Why do you call the mayor your brother? He's not your brother. You had one brother, Ralph, he's gone." And Charlie tried to explain that we were close personal and political friends, and therefore we call each other brother. That did not satisfy Mom. And then she was ill and hospitalized, and I came to visit and brought some flowers and a note that said, "Since my mother's gone and Charlie is my brother, therefore you're my mother too." Charlie said he didn't mind that so much, but when she started bragging about my son the mayor instead of my son the congressman, that was too much.
The problem with that joke is that it's true.
Charlie, let me just say while you're here on the air, that which I say to people every day, that you can't buy seniority. And folks need to understand and appreciate the value of a Congressman Charles B. Rangel, who's been there in the Congress, 42 years, is it? 43 years.
43, yes.
And you can't buy that. And so I hope that anybody who hears this will help spread the word. That I know we're supposed to be nonpartisan and all, but let me tell you, we're talking about our fate here. We're talking about our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and that which you have already done and that which I know you will continue to do as we continue you in office is so important.
Well, it is an historic occasion, since the 60s we had Adam Clayton Powell, and I've served for the last 43 years. And the big problem is that June 24th is the primary election, but it's the only primary election. No one else is running, not the city council, not the state legislature. And so it's very difficult to get people to understand that voting in a primary for Democrats is voting for the November election. It's the same thing. You don't participate in the primary. You're out of business in November. And so the biggest problem that we have is to inform, register, and to pull out the vote for the people on June the 24th. And it's going to be a big problem because our voters are not used to June primaries. They're used to September. And there was really no excuse for the state legislature not combining all of the primaries in June. Would have saved $50 million, but more importantly, it would have increased the number of people that would have come out for other candidates. But that is a deal that's already been cut in Albany. And, like I said, I wasn't drafted for this job, right? Right.
Right. Speaking of drafts, you as a Bronze Star hero and Purple Heart, and I tell people that I say, I agree with Charlie Rangel. There ought to be a universal draft. People should be, upon attaining a certain age, maybe 18, should be required to register and serve in either one of the branches, the military branches, or something like the Peace Corps. Everybody, so we don't have old men sending young men to fight battles.
Well, you know more than most people haven't been a Marine. How you go in maybe screaming and scratching and raising hell, but you come out with a sense of pride, and that's just not the military, but it's doing something for your country, having people say thank you for your service, and making a contribution, whether it's in education or health care. But you're right about the last point. Most people have no idea. The last time this great nation, the Congress declared war, was in 1941. All of those subsequent times, presidents, Republican and Democrats, have torn up the Constitution and put out men and women in harm's way. It's been easy for old men down here in Washington to say we should introduce troops, whether it's Vietnam, Korea, whether it's Grenada, whatever it is. And we still talk about troops as though we're talking about our kids. We're not talking about our kids. We're talking about other people's kids. And if you take a look as to where the recruiting are going, all you have to do is look for the highest areas of unemployment, and that's where you're going to find the intensified recruiting effort. It's just unfair. It's immoral. And again, you don't hear from the churches. They bless the guns and they pray for the troops and they have their chaplains. But the whole idea of killing people without constitutional authority, and I include the drones, is not a Democratic Republican issue. It's a moral issue, and it's what this country's history is going to say we stood for.
Well, I agree. And that's among the reasons we need your voice in the Congress and to continue on and on and on. My bride and I, we have 2 grandchildren, and who knows, we may have some great-grandchildren. And I'm going to be looking for Congressman Rangel to be seeing to it that laws get passed that will protect them. And I need Congressman Rangel there for me.
Charles, Congressman Rangel there for me and my grandkids, because if ever anyone says that we got to invade this particular country because they're a threat to our national security, if I think they're talking about my 3 grandchildren, I want to know what the hell is the national security. And that's what every member of Congress should say. If Americans are going to be placed in harm's way, and also undocumented immigrants as well, we should know what the hell is our national security. And why does it come to such a surprise that we always find a vested national security interest where there's oil?
How about that?
The connection between oil and the intrusion of American troops, they're twins. They're connected. And everybody knew that President Bush and the Prime Minister of Great Britain, they were cutting up the oil fields in Iraq before we invaded. So it's clear that it's our economic interest, but not our national security interest that takes our troops abroad like that.
Well, we're only have a few minutes left. I just want to say to my brother that I am so pleased that you were able to cut a piece of time out so you could say hello and goodbye. It was particularly important to have you here with Glenn Hunter, who, as you know, is going to have you and me and Basil talk about Percy up at the Great Hall at City University. Do we have a date, Glenn?
September 26th.
September 26th.
6 p.m. to 9 p.m.
And you know, we got a lot of stories we can tell about Percy, but one thing is we have Percy to thank, really, for you running for Congress in the first place.
Well, I tell you that you really miss them. You don't appreciate people as much as we should when they're here. But to paraphrase an expression that is oft-time used, and that is, what would Percy Sutton do?
Yes.
And he always was, he had that special touch, whether it was creating a black and Hispanic caucus, whether it was the marathon, whether it was radio stations, TV, no matter what it was, his mind was so creative, and he made things look so easy, even though he was one of the hardest working people I ever met.
Yeah, well, I when we had Roscoe on earlier, and he was talking about how Percy, when he first met Percy was when he was riding the subways as a conductor. And Percy, I think he had something like 3 jobs at that time. It was amazing. It really is amazing.
He's going to law school then.
Yeah, well, you know, and his brother Oliver, even though he was in the shadows, their civil rights DNA certainly did run throughout the Sutton family. They fought when they didn't have to fight, and I think all of us, I know all of us are just a lot better in knowing and having worked with them. Maybe one day you'll tell that story about what a great driver Percy
I did.
was.
I talked about it earlier. How you and I had to sue him.
Yeah.
But there are lots of great stories that we're going to talk about up at City College, the Great Hall, in September. And so I got to sign off now. And Charlie, I cannot tell you how much I appreciate. I'm not surprised, because you this is what you and I try to do for each other, but it's very important to me that you were able to carve out a piece of time to help me say goodbye to the family, as I call our listeners here at WLIB. So I thank Glenn Hunter and
my brother the mayor, you know, what the hell, you got to let it accept, right?
Right. All right.
Take care. Good luck. See you soon.
Okay, brother.
Goodbye, Mr.
Love you. Love you.
And I thank all the wonderful listeners who stuck with me for all of these years, some 20 years plus now, listening to me talk about various topics. Without all of you, there would have been no show, and I thank you for bringing me into your homes. Our engineer, as is almost always the case, has been Jesse Mead. Jesse, I thank you, good buddy. I'd ask you to stay tuned for Al Sharpton. I'm Dave Dinkins. This has been Dialogue with Dinkins. Until we meet again, keep the faith.